There was a time when treating your spouse with respect was not optional but expected. When partnership in marriage meant building each other up rather than tearing each other down, especially in public. But what happened on Family Feud one Thursday afternoon in October 2024 would remind millions of viewers that mockery has no place in a loving relationship. When 44-year-old Robert Patterson laughed at his wife Sarah's answer on national television and made a comment that crossed every line of decency, Steve Harvey did something that host had never done before. He stopped the game mid-round and demanded an apology on the spot. What happened next proved that respect is not just a value from the past, but a requirement for any marriage worth keeping. If you believe every spouse deserves to be treated with kindness and respect, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to see more moments where accountability matters. The Patterson family from Birmingham, Alabama, stood on the Family Feud stage, representing what appeared to be a typical American family. Robert Patterson was a 44-year-old civil engineer who worked for a major construction company. He carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being the smartest person in the room, always ready with a correction or a better way to do things. His wife Sarah, 42 years old, had been a stay-at-home mother for the past 15 years, dedicating her life to raising their 3 children who now ranged in age from 14 to 19. Sarah had married Robert right out of college, putting aside her own dreams of becoming a teacher to support his career. She had followed him through 3 different cities as his job required relocations. She had managed every aspect of their household, from paying bills to coordinating schedules to maintaining relationships with extended family on both sides. She had done all of this while raising their children largely on her own, as Robert's demanding job often kept him away for long hours and frequent business trips. Standing beside Sarah and Robert on the stage were their oldest daughter, Emily, age 19 and home from college for the taping, their son Michael at 17, and Robert's younger sister Janet with her husband Tom. The family had applied to be on Family Feud as a way to celebrate Emily's acceptance to medical school. They had practiced together for weeks, watching old episodes and quizzing each other on common survey answers. Sarah had been nervous about appearing on television, but her children had encouraged her, saying it would be fun. What the studio audience did not know was that Robert had a pattern of belittling Sarah that had developed over their 20 years of marriage. It had started small with little corrections about how she loaded the dishwasher or organized the pantry. Over the years, it had grown into a constant stream of criticism about everything from how she dressed to how she spoke to how she handled money. Robert justified this behavior as trying to help Sarah improve herself. Sarah had learned to accept it as normal, the price of being married to someone so much smarter and more successful than she was. Their children had grown up watching their father dismiss their mother's opinions and ideas. Emily had internalized a belief that women needed to be perfect to deserve respect. Michael had started treating his own girlfriends with similar dismissiveness, having learned from his father's example. The youngest daughter, 14-year-old Sophie, who was watching from the audience, had developed anxiety around speaking up in class because she was terrified of saying something wrong and being laughed at the way her mother was laughed at home. The game had started well enough. The Patterson family was competing against the Williams family from Ohio, and both teams were evenly matched. Robert had answered the first question confidently and correctly, earning his family control of the board. They had successfully completed that round without any strikes. The second round had gone to the Williams family. Now, in the third round, it was Sarah's turn to face off against the Williams family captain at the center podium. Steve Harvey stood at center stage and announced the question with his characteristic energy. He asked both contestants to name something people buy that they hope they never have to use. Sarah and her opponent both reached for the buzzer, but Sarah was slightly faster. Steve turned to her with an encouraging smile and asked for her answer. Sarah thought for just a moment and then said fire extinguisher. It was a perfectly reasonable answer, exactly the kind of practical thinking that came from managing a household for 2 decades. Before Steve could even turn to check the board, Robert let out a loud, mocking laugh from his position at the family podium. The microphones picked up his voice clearly as he said loud enough for everyone to hear that, of course, Sarah would say something boring and obvious like that. He added that she never could think outside the box, always going for the most simple-minded answer possible. The studio audience gasped at his open disrespect. Sarah's face flushed red with humiliation. Her daughter Emily looked mortified. Steve Harvey's expression shifted from his usual playful demeanor to something much more serious. Steve did not check the board. Instead, he walked directly over to the Patterson family podium where Robert stood looking pleased with himself, apparently thinking his comment had been clever rather than cruel. Steve stood directly in front of Robert and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly throughout the studio. He asked Robert if he had really just said what Steve thought he heard. Robert, still not understanding the gravity of what he had done, shrugged and said he was just being honest. He explained that Sarah always gave simple answers and that someone needed to push her to think more creatively. Steve set down his cards on the podium and asked Robert how long he had been married to Sarah. Robert answered that they had been married for 20 years. Steve nodded slowly and then asked Robert if in those 20 years he had learned anything about how to treat his wife with respect. Robert looked confused, clearly not understanding why Steve was making such a big deal out of what he considered a harmless comment. He started to say that he respected Sarah just fine, but Steve held up his hand to stop him. Steve turned to address the studio audience and the cameras. He explained that in all his years of hosting Family Feud, he had seen families get competitive and people get nervous and contestants say things they did not mean in the heat of the moment. But what he had just witnessed was not a heat-of-the-moment comment. It was deliberate mockery of a spouse on national television. He said that he could not and would not allow that to continue on his stage. He made it clear that Family Feud was supposed to be about families having fun together, not about husbands humiliating their wives. Steve walked back over to where Sarah still stood at the center podium, clearly trying not to cry. He spoke to her gently, asking if she was okay. Sarah nodded but could not quite meet his eyes. Steve asked her if Robert talked to her like that at home. There was a long pause before Sarah quietly admitted that, yes, he often made comments like that about her intelligence and her abilities. She said she had learned to ignore it, that it did not really bother her anymore. But the way her voice shook gave away the lie in her words. Steve's expression grew even more serious. He turned back to Robert and spoke in a voice that left no room for argument. He told Robert that what he had just done was not okay. He explained that marriage was supposed to be a partnership built on mutual respect and support. He said that laughing at your spouse and calling them simple-minded in front of millions of people was not just disrespectful, it was emotionally abusive. The word abuse hung in the air like a weight. Robert's face flushed, but now it was with anger rather than embarrassment. Robert tried to defend himself. He insisted that Steve was overreacting and that Sarah knew he was just joking around. He claimed that they had that kind of relationship where they teased each other and that Sarah was fine with it. Steve immediately turned to Sarah and asked her directly if she was fine with being mocked on national television. Sarah hesitated, caught between her ingrained habit of protecting Robert's ego and the opportunity to finally be honest about how his treatment made her feel. In that moment of hesitation, her daughter Emily spoke up from her position at the family podium. Emily, 19 years old and clearly tired of watching her father disrespect her mother, addressed Steve directly. She explained that her father had been talking to her mother like this for as long as she could remember. She said that growing up, she had thought it was normal for husbands to constantly correct and criticize their wives. It was only when she went to college and started learning about healthy relationships that she realized what she had witnessed her whole life was not normal at all. She said she had tried to talk to her father about it, but he always dismissed her concerns just like he dismissed everything her mother said. The studio audience was completely silent, riveted by what was unfolding. Robert looked shocked that his daughter had spoken against him. Michael, the 17-year-old son, looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Janet, Robert's sister, stepped forward and added her voice to Emily's. She admitted that she had noticed how Robert treated Sarah over the years and had tried to say something to him privately on multiple occasions. She said that Robert always insisted he was just trying to help Sarah be better, but that his constant criticism had the opposite effect of making Sarah doubt herself constantly. Steve Harvey made a decision in that moment that would become one of the most talked about moments in Family Feud history. He announced that the game would not continue until Robert apologized to Sarah properly and sincerely. He specified that the apology needed to acknowledge what Robert had done wrong and commit to treating Sarah differently going forward. He made it clear that a quick and insincere sorry would not be acceptable. The audience erupted in applause, clearly supporting Steve's decision. Robert stood at the podium looking cornered. His first instinct was to refuse, to insist that Steve had no right to make such demands. He started to say that this was just a game show and that Steve was taking things way too seriously. But Steve interrupted him firmly. He explained that this was not about the game show anymore. This was about a husband who had disrespected his wife in front of millions of people and needed to make it right. He added that if Robert was not willing to apologize, Then the Patterson family would be disqualified and would need to leave the stage. Emily stepped closer to her father and spoke to him quietly but firmly. She told him that he needed to do this, not just for the cameras or for the game, but for their family. She said that if he could not apologize to her mother for humiliating her on national television, then she did not know how they could have a relationship going forward. The ultimatum from his daughter seemed to cut through Robert's defensiveness in a way that nothing else had. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. Sarah stood at the center podium with tears streaming down her face, no longer trying to hide them. Her hands were shaking. 20 years of accumulated hurt and dismissiveness had risen to the surface all at once. Steve walked over to her and gently guided her to stand near her family. He brought Robert to stand facing Sarah, creating a moment of accountability that could not be avoided. Robert opened his mouth to speak, but Steve stopped him. He told Robert to take a moment and really think about what he needed to say. Not what would get him out of trouble, but what Sarah actually deserved to hear. After a long pause, Robert finally spoke. His voice was quieter than before, stripped of its earlier arrogance. He told Sarah that he was sorry for laughing at her answer and for the comment he had made. He acknowledged that it was disrespectful and hurtful, but Steve shook his head and said that was not enough. He pushed Robert to go deeper, to acknowledge the pattern of behavior that Emily and Janet had described. Steve asked Robert directly if he had been treating Sarah this way throughout their marriage. Robert hesitated, then slowly nodded. He admitted that he had been critical of Sarah for years, always pointing out what she did wrong instead of appreciating what she did right. Steve asked Robert why he thought he had the right to treat his wife that way. Robert struggled to answer. He tried to explain that he had high standards and wanted the best for his family. Steve cut him off and pointed out that having high standards was not an excuse for being cruel. He explained that Sarah had sacrificed her own career and dreams to support Robert's success and raise their children. He asked Robert if he had ever thanked her for those sacrifices, or if he had only criticized the ways she fell short of his impossible standards. Robert could not answer because they both knew what the truth was. Steve turned to Sarah and asked her what she needed to hear from her husband. Sarah looked surprised by the question, as if she had never considered that her needs mattered in this equation. After a moment, she found her voice. She said that she needed Robert to understand that she was not stupid or simple-minded or any of the other things his comments implied. She explained that she had managed their entire household for 20 years, raised 3 children who were turning into good people, and handled countless challenges while Robert was at work. She said that her contributions might not be as flashy as Robert's engineering projects, but they were just as valuable and deserved just as much respect. The audience applauded Sarah's words. For the first time, she was seeing that other people recognized her worth even if her husband had failed to do so. Robert looked chastened, finally beginning to understand the impact of his behavior. Steve prompted him to respond to what Sarah had said. Robert took a deep breath and delivered an apology that sounded more genuine than his first attempt. He told Sarah that she was right, that he had taken her for granted and failed to appreciate everything she did for their family. He admitted that he had been wrong to criticize her constantly and that she deserved better treatment from him. Steve asked Robert if he was willing to commit to changing his behavior going forward. Robert said yes, though Steve made it clear that words were easy and actions were what would matter. He suggested that the Patterson family seek marriage counseling to address the patterns that had developed over their 20 years together. Robert agreed, and Sarah, looking both hopeful and cautious, also agreed. Steve announced that his foundation would provide them with access to top marriage counselors who specialized in helping couples rebuild respect and communication in their relationships. With the apology delivered and accepted at least for the moment, Steve made the decision to continue the game. But before they resumed play, he turned to the cameras and delivered a message directly to viewers. He spoke about the importance of treating your spouse with respect and kindness, especially in public. He emphasized that marriage was supposed to be about building each other up, not tearing each other down. He acknowledged that everyone makes mistakes and has bad moments, but that patterns of disrespect needed to be confronted and changed. The studio audience gave him a standing ovation. The game resumed, but the energy had completely shifted. When Steve finally checked the board for Sarah's original answer of fire extinguisher, it was revealed to be the number 2 answer worth 26 points. The audience cheered loudly for Sarah, validating her answer and by extension validating her. The Patterson family ended up winning their game and advancing to Fast Money, where they won the $20,000 prize. But the money was overshadowed by the profound moment of accountability that had occurred during the game. When the episode aired 6 weeks later, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The clip of Steve Harvey forcing Robert to apologize went viral within hours, accumulating over 150 million views across all platforms in the first week alone. Social media exploded with reactions. Women shared their own stories of being dismissed and belittled by partners. Men posted reflections on times they had failed to show their wives proper respect and appreciation. Marriage counselors reported a surge in couples seeking help, many of them citing the Patterson family episode as their wake-up call. The hashtag #RespectYourSpouse trended worldwide for several days. Psychologists and relationship experts were invited on talk shows to discuss the dynamics they had witnessed in the Patterson family and how common such patterns were in marriages. Many experts pointed out that emotional abuse often goes unrecognized because it does not leave physical marks, but that its impact on self-esteem and mental health can be devastating. The episode became a teaching tool in counseling programs and domestic violence prevention workshops across the country. True to his word, Steve Harvey connected the Patterson family with excellent marriage counselors. Sarah and Robert began intensive couples therapy within a week of the episode taping. The process was difficult and painful. Robert had to confront the fact that his behavior over the years had been emotionally abusive, a label he had resisted fiercely at first. He had to examine where his need to criticize and control had come from and learn new ways of communicating with Sarah that were based on respect rather than superiority. Sarah had her own work to do in therapy. She needed to rebuild her self-esteem after years of being told she was not good enough. She had to learn to set boundaries and to speak up when Robert slipped back into old patterns. She also had to decide whether she wanted to stay in the marriage or whether the damage was too deep to repair. For several months, the outcome was uncertain. Robert and Sarah separated for a time while they each did individual therapy in addition to their couple sessions. Their children were profoundly affected by what had happened on Family Feud and its aftermath. Emily reported feeling relieved that the dynamic she had grown up with was finally being named and addressed. She shared that she had started her own therapy to process the impact of watching her mother be diminished throughout her childhood. Michael, the 17-year-old son, initially defended his father, but eventually came to understand how his father's treatment of his mother had shaped his own attitudes toward women. He began working on changing those patterns before they became as deeply ingrained as they were in his father. Sophie, the youngest at 14, benefited perhaps most from the changes in her family. As her mother grew stronger and more confident through therapy, Sophie watched and learned that women deserved respect and did not have to accept being treated as lesser. Her anxiety about speaking up in class began to diminish. She started raising her hand more in school and sharing her ideas without the paralyzing fear that she would be mocked for getting something wrong. Her teachers noticed the change and commended her growing confidence. 1 year after the episode aired, Steve Harvey invited the Patterson family back for a follow-up segment on his talk show. The transformation was remarkable. Sarah walked onto the stage with a confidence that had been completely absent during the Family Feud taping. She had gone back to school to finish her teaching degree, something she had set aside 20 years earlier when she married Robert. She spoke about the journey of the past year with honesty and grace, acknowledging that it had been incredibly difficult but ultimately necessary for her own well-being and for the health of her family. Robert appeared on the show as well, though in a separate segment to allow Sarah to speak freely without his presence influencing her words. Robert was candid about how hard it had been to confront his own behavior and to accept that he had been emotionally abusive to his wife for years. He explained that he had grown up in a household where his father treated his mother similarly, and he had unconsciously replicated that pattern in his own marriage. He spoke about the ongoing work he was doing in therapy to change deeply ingrained habits of thinking and communicating. Steve asked Robert directly if he and Sarah were still together. Robert explained that they had reconciled after several months of separation, but that their marriage looked very different now. He said that Sarah had set clear boundaries about what behavior she would and would not accept, and that he was committed to respecting those boundaries. He acknowledged that he still sometimes slipped into old patterns, but that Sarah now called him out immediately, and he was learning to apologize genuinely and change his behavior rather than getting defensive. The follow-up episode also featured their daughter Emily, who had become an advocate for young women recognizing and avoiding emotionally abusive relationships. She spoke on college campuses about the warning signs she had learned to identify and the importance of understanding what healthy relationships looked like. She credited the public nature of what had happened on Family Feud with giving her the courage to speak up, saying that if her family's experience could help even one person leave an unhealthy relationship or seek help to fix one, then the embarrassment of having their problems aired on national television was worth it. The impact of the Patterson family episode extended far beyond their own healing. Marriage and family therapists reported that many couples came to therapy specifically referencing the episode and asking if their own relationships showed similar patterns. Some couples realized they had been engaging in mutual disrespect and needed to rebuild a foundation of kindness. Others realized that one partner had been systematically undermining the other, just as Robert had done to Sarah. The episode helped many people put words to dynamics they had felt but not been able to name. Churches and faith communities used the episode in marriage enrichment programs and premarital counseling. Religious leaders across denominations spoke about the importance of treating your spouse with the same respect and honor that you would want for yourself. Many pointed out that regardless of religious tradition, the principle of treating others with dignity and respect was universal. The episode sparked important conversations in faith communities about how to address emotional abuse, which was often overlooked in favor of focusing only on physical violence or infidelity. Family Feud itself instituted new protocols after the Patterson family episode. Producers were trained to watch for signs of disrespect or abuse between family members during the pre-show process. Counseling resources were made available to any families who revealed concerning dynamics during their time on the show. Steve Harvey made it known that he would not tolerate any contestant treating another family member disrespectfully on his stage, and that he would not hesitate to stop a game to address such behavior if it occurred again. 3 years after the original episode, Sarah completed her teaching degree and began working as a third-grade teacher in Birmingham. She found immense fulfillment in her career and in having an identity beyond being Robert's wife and her children's mother. Robert supported her career in ways he had never supported her interests before, adjusting his own schedule to share household responsibilities more equally. Their marriage was not perfect, and they continued to work with a counselor regularly, but it was built on a foundation of mutual respect that had been completely absent before. The episode where Steve Harvey made a husband apologize on stage remained one of the most viewed and most discussed Family Feud moments of all time. It transcended being just a viral clip to become a cultural touchstone for discussions about respect in marriage and emotional abuse. Media scholars studied it as an example of how unscripted television could create moments of genuine social impact. The episode was used in academic settings to discuss gender roles, power dynamics in relationships, and the importance of public accountability for private behavior. For Sarah Patterson, the moment when Steve Harvey stopped the game and demanded her husband apologize was the turning point of her life. She often reflected on how different her life might have been if Robert's mockery had simply been allowed to pass without comment, as it had been allowed to pass for 20 years in their private life. The public accountability forced a reckoning that private suffering never would have. She became an advocate for other women in emotionally abusive marriages, speaking at domestic violence prevention events and women's shelters about her experience and the journey to reclaiming her self-worth. Steve Harvey spoke about the Patterson family episode in numerous interviews over the years. He described it as one of the most important moments of his career, not because it was dramatic or entertaining, but because it represented his values in action. He explained that he could have let the moment pass, could have checked the board and moved on with the game to avoid controversy. But doing so would have sent the message that it was acceptable to mock and belittle your spouse, and that was a message he refused to send. He said that sometimes being a host meant being willing to use your platform to stand up for what is right, even when it makes people uncomfortable. The legacy of that October afternoon extended across generations. Young people who watched the episode learned what disrespect looked like and determined not to replicate it in their own future relationships. Parents used it as a teaching moment with their children about how to treat romantic partners. Educators incorporated it into health and relationships curricula in schools. The ripple effects of one man being held accountable for mockery spread far wider than anyone could have anticipated. Looking back on the moment when Robert laughed at Sarah's answer, viewers could see it as the culmination of 20 years of accumulated disrespect finally being brought into the light. The laugh itself was not the problem. The problem was the pattern of behavior it represented, the years of making Sarah feel small and stupid and less than. Steve Harvey's intervention did not fix that pattern overnight, but it forced it into the open where it could finally be addressed. It gave Sarah permission to acknowledge that she deserved better. It gave their children a new model for what relationships should look like. And it gave Robert the opportunity, if he chose to take it, to become a better husband and father. The story of the Patterson family served as a powerful reminder that respect is not optional in a marriage. It is the foundation upon which everything else is built. Without respect, love becomes hollow. Without respect, partnership becomes domination. Without respect, a marriage may continue to exist in form, but it dies in substance. The episode showed millions of viewers that it is never too late to demand respect, never too late to change harmful patterns, and never too late to rebuild a relationship on a healthier foundation. If this story reminded you of the importance of treating your spouse with kindness and respect every single day, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this with someone who needs to remember that mockery has no place in a loving relationship and that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. Because in the end, the way we treat the people closest to us reveals who we truly are, and respect is not just something we owe our spouses, but something we owe ourselves.